Welcome back to my podcast. My name is Dominique Hoffman. In today's episode, I will be reacting to the Glenn Greenwald Jubilee Surrounded episode with Glenn versus 20 MAGA supporters, because yours truly was one of the 20 MAGA supporters who debated Glenn. Before I even get into the episode, I want to thank Jubilee, the producers at Jubilee, the entire staff were nothing but professional, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with them. Now, if you watched the entirety of the Jubilee debate, and if you are even just aware of Glenn Greenwald's political worldview and ethos, he views American intervention abroad, he views war and conflict as a form of neocolonialism. So where I would say that's an example of American exceptionalism and the United States as a force for good globally, imperfect, yes. Better than a world governed by China or Russia? Absolutely. I don't even know why that's now a controversial thing to say in the United States, both on the left and the right. But I'm glad for a global world order in which the United States is still the sole hegemonic power that then gets to, by privilege of being the sole hegemonic power, dictate norms of engagement globally. Glenn would say that's a form of neocolonialism and that the United States has no business sanctioning another nation. They have no business militarily intervening in another nation. His only solution was diplomacy. And ironically, we're going to look at that again today. Diplomacy with the IRGC has historically failed. And the reason it's historically failed is diplomacy, at least in our understanding of modern diplomacy, is defined by Western norms of engagement. But if the actor you are trying to negotiate with fundamentally rejects the terms of engagement, diplomacy is going to go nowhere really fast. Diplomacy can work with illiberal regimes like China, for example, because most countries, and Russia as well, understand politics in a realpolitik, realism, zero-sum way. When Trump says, if you bomb us, we're going to wipe your civilization off the map, those are terms in which an illiberal, theocratic, Islamic terrorist state understand. That is a red line, that is a threat. Now, the Western world was absolutely outraged by that tweet President Trump put out. Mind you, the rhetoric could have been a little bit better. But these illiberal regimes don't calculate their war calculus in the same way as a democracy might. And there's many reasons for that. One, their leaders are not democratically elected, and therefore it doesn't matter if war is popular to the general electorate. There is no say of the people and if they escalate to war. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I don't think Putin for one second thought, how is this going to fare for me as far as audience cost domestically? Why? Well, because Russia isn't a democracy. Whereas we have seen democracy at work with the pushback to President Trump's Operation Epic Fury. Now, I would say I completely, to this day, post this debate, support President Trump's decision to militarily respond to the IRGC. Why? Again, because diplomacy has always failed. And when you watch the whole Surrounded episode, that's the only solution Glenn Greenwald provides or alternative to President Trump's military action. And even in that, he doesn't concede that President Trump first tried diplomacy. And so Glenn, being a libertarian, leaning more, I would say, ideologically woke right, has the benefit of an atheist when it comes to debate and argumentation. Their positioning is that of objecting to the current status quo or the current geopolitical agenda. They don't typically offer an alternative solution. So, for example, if you were to ask an atheist, okay, so then if morality is subjective and there's no such thing as a universal truth, capital T, then why is murder wrong? And they'll come up with a myriad of different answers, but they oftentimes can't pinpoint a concrete alternative to what they're objecting to. They'll just say, well, there's no such thing as universal truth because there's no God. Okay. But then you have to prove otherwise. And that's where Glenn, in this debate, he objected to Trump's foreign policy. He then also objected to Biden's foreign policy, to Obama's foreign policy, and to the Bush administration's foreign policy. And when I pushed him on, okay, so then what is the solution? He really didn't give a substantive or intellectually honest answer. Now, Glenn is, I believe, an almost 60-year-old constitutional lawyer and journalist. I would expect that he would have a more robust alternative than just saying, oh, well, we shouldn't get involved. And when I asked him, well, you object to sanctions as well. So then if you object to sanctions because it's their money and you object to any form of military intervention, then what is your solution? And eventually he responded to me that, well, the IRGC actually aren't the nefarious bad actors that the West has propagated them to be. And my conclusion in debating Glenn is that then fundamentally you are an apologist for the IRGC, because if you can't condemn the IRGC If you can't even concede that sanctions are necessary then to deter Iranian aggression or to hinder the regime's ability to aggress on its neighbors or even the United States and our allies in Europe, then essentially what you're saying is we should just take all hands off Iran and let them act belligerently, even though they undermine our security interests in the Middle East, Europe, and even at home. If a country did that, if a nation did that, if an empire, if the global hegemon allowed that to happen, it would be security suicide. And Glenn knows that. He just ideologically is compromised, and that's why he can't concede to it. So in addition to this episode being released on Memorial Day, there was a lot of news about Trump's geopolitical agenda. One of them was that this weekend, Trump announced he was really close to a deal with Iran. Now, this has happened quite a few times, and then there's some sort of military interaction. I believe President Trump even stayed home from his son's wedding to try and reach an agreement with the IRGC. And today, there's news that on Monday morning, the United States launched new strikes on Iran, targeting missile sites and boats. So the U.S. said it launched new strikes on southern Iran on Monday, targeting Iranian missile sites and boats attempting to place mines. The strikes were in, quote, self-defense and designed to, quote, protect our troops from threats posed by Iranian forces. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, said on Tuesday it had downed a U.S. drone and fired at a fighter jet and another drone that entered Iranian airspace. State media reported. It did not specify when this happened. This news that we were really close to a diplomatic agreement with the IRGC, only for it to be spoiled yet again, is only further evidence to counter Glenn's objection or claims that diplomacy should be what President Trump was seeking instead of direct military action. Diplomacy is only effective if the adversary believes that if they cross a red line, you will respond. Because if not, then diplomacy looks a lot more like the Obama administration, where we just continue to capitulate to the regime, which empowered them diplomatically and militarily, and then also with the Biden administration, economically. And then when we zoom out from looking at just Iran, we're seeing a new reordering of geopolitics in a post-COVID-19 world that protects American hegemony. Just to revisit some basic definitions, we live in an anarchical world order, meaning that there's nothing above the state level sovereignty. So the United States acts in their interest, Russia acts in their interest, China acts in their interest, and then smaller, weaker nations typically align themselves based off of ideology or strategic interest and or both with larger superpowers. In a post-World War II global order, we lived in a bipolar world, meaning there was two equally strong global powers. You had the United States and you had the USSR. Now, the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. And with that, we saw the United States emerge as the sole global hegemonic power, meaning we lived in a unipolar world. There was only one global superpower. Under Cold War bipolarity, there was essentially mutually assured destruction. And global conflict was fought in different proxy wars, even Vietnam, for example, between the United States and the Soviet Union, who were vying for influence in strategic geopolitical areas. Interestingly enough, and you will hear Glenn Greenwald reference this in his debate, the United States in a CIA coup backed the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran because they were more friendly to Western influence in the region. This helped counter Russia's influence in the region. And despite the fact that Glenn and other anti-neocolonialist ideologues claim that it was Western U.S. influence and CIA coups that turned the Middle East against the West, someone like Osama bin Laden was vehemently against both the USSR's presence in the Middle East and Western presence in the Middle East. But during the Cold War, we saw strategic geopolitical strongholds, the Gulf states being very important when you look at oil production, and proxy wars essentially broke out globally over the Cold War period, fighting between these two ideologies, the West and democracy and the USSR and communism. Now, the USSR kind of imploded on itself, because it turns out, economically speaking and politically speaking, with the fatigue of communism, repression of your own people only works for so many decades until it essentially falls apart. And Cuba right now is the perfect example of that. Now, at the end of the Cold War, a lot of geopolitical and political science theorists hypothesized that we had reached the end of history because democracy won out at the end of the 20th century's long ideological wars. World War II saw the defeat of fascism and the end of the Cold War in 1989, officially ending it, but around 1991, we saw communism defeated. Political theorists such as Fukuyama hypothesized that we were not going to see conflicts arise along ideological lines because democracy had won. Now, it's important to note that Fukuyama wasn't saying no conflicts would exist, just that liberal democracy and capitalism had won. Now, interestingly enough, and this is for a completely different episode, but I think it's important to note, the end of the title of his book is The End of History and the Last Man. So Fukuyama worried that because the ideological struggle had ended, societies would become spiritually empty. We've seen that here in the West. They would become consumeristic because capitalism was the prevailing economic ideology. They would become risk-averse and purposeless. And I would largely say that that's correct. Now, where I would disagree with and where I think history played out in a way that a lot of political theorists didn't see coming was the resurgence of communism ideologically, and also communism becoming attractive from within democracies. What I don't think Fukuyama or Huntington or other political theorists could have anticipated was the rise of critical theory in the classroom and the ideological possession of the woke left or the neo-Marxist youth. And that same kind of ideology, except more on the neo-fascist side, emerging, capturing the attention ideologically of the conservative youth. So we're having these neo-iterations of both communism, Marxism, and fascism emerge from within democracies. To zoom back into President Trump's geopolitical agenda, he is reorienting the world back to a strong America where there's no question that we still live in a unipolar world. When I was in college, a lot of people theorized that by the time we were now, 10 years later in 2026, we would be living in a bipolar world governed by not the US and the USSR, but by the United States and China. COVID-19 kind of proved that China was a little bit more of a paper tiger than the world had understood it to be or anticipated. Same thing with Russia. Russia is now 3.5, almost 4 years into a war with Ukraine that it initiated and has still been unable to gain significant territorial concessions or decisively win. They're fighting with essentially Cold War technology, and they're reliant on China and Iran to supply them with the necessary equipment to even sustain their invasion. So we have China that's a little bit weaker than we had anticipated, although I don't want to downplay the threat of China. We have Russia, which I would say, again, is largely a shell of its Cold War hegemony. Ideologically is threatening. And when you put China, Russia, and Iran and this axis of chaos all together, if you pool all of their capabilities, they are a formidable threat. But the United States is still the single global hegemonic power, and President Trump is now reorienting the global world order post-COVID-19 to ensure that as we continue to globalize, the United States will be at those key strategic geopolitical strongholds. We have access of the Panama Canal. We have taken over Venezuela, and we've helped eliminate threats in our Western hemisphere to U.S. security interest. Now, because Cuba heavily relied on Venezuela for its oil, Cuba has now essentially been in a blockade, unlike anything we've seen in history, except for maybe during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So from the time that this Glenn Greenwald episode was recorded to now, we have only seen President Trump make further gains in strategically securing important outposts and eliminating the presence of China and Russia. Raul Castro has been indicted just like Maduro was indicted. And so I'm sure we're likely to see a fall of the Cuban regime in the coming months, simultaneously happening with the operation in Iran. And there's no boots on the ground needed in Cuba. So this is brilliant statecraft happening in real time. I mean, historically, I think we're going to look back on what President Trump has done and say that this is maybe the most strategic geopolitical gains the United States has made, playing chess downfield anticipating Chinese and Russian influence and how that might compromise our security, not just for the present and now, but down the road. One last thing, and then we'll get into the reaction of this video. If you've even made it this far, it's a lot of technical jargon. But fundamentally, the debate with Glenn is really technical. And what we're seeing on the new right is this emerging language that talks about complex geopolitical issues as if they're extremely simple, when this is not simple. This is extremely complex. It's path dependent on multiple actors. It's not just looking back to history to then game tree it out and see, okay, how do we anticipate Russia and China to respond and act? But it's also anticipating how they're going to use their strategic outpost in the West against the United States in the coming year, 5 years, or decade. So President Trump is not just securing U.S. interests for tomorrow, but for a decade, 2 decades down the road. And I don't think the general population is aware of that. Instead, they hear war bad. Trump is a war-making president, not a peacemaking president. And I think that's intellectually dishonest, especially for someone like Glenn Greenwald, who's very much aware of the higher level strategic thinking behind President Trump's actions. And then he just defaults to war bad, war not peace. And here's the thing. President Trump is a peacemaking president insofar as he's ensuring peace for the United States decades down the road with his reorienting of strategic U.S. strongholds. And that is inherently America first. It's just America first playing the long game. Whereas capitulating to Iran, which has been the status quo for the last 40 years, has only perpetuated conflict in the Middle East. And it props up the regime and it emboldens them and allows them to belligerently act beyond their actual threat capacity. I mean, the Iranian regime, yes, is a threat, and it has been a threat to the United States. But if we continue to bolster them up, it legitimizes them, and it does allow them to rebuild their infrastructure and obtain capabilities that would then be a huge threat. But if we're the far stronger nation, and we just continue to bend the knee to Iran, it allows them to perpetuate their attrition and their terrorism, when in all actuality, they don't really have the chips to be doing that. They don't really have any negotiation pieces to fall back on. President Trump literally said the only reason members of the IRGC are alive today is so they can negotiate. They have nothing to offer concession-wise to the United States except to step down. And that's why the IRGC will not engage diplomatically, because fundamentally, at the end of the day, the IRGC is a terror organization. The terror organization is most interested in the survival of the organization above all else, which means they are operating from a critical theory framework, meaning they are acting as rational actors. They're not irrational just because they're terrorists. The only difference is their rationality is defined by cosmic terms. They don't see death as a deterrent. They're fighting a cosmic war. The survival of the regime is what's most important. And even for credibility reason, the IRGC heads, as we've seen already, would rather die than to bend a knee to the United States, because it would undermine the credibility and the ideological framework that fundamentally underpins the political ideology of the IRGC, which, just like Hamas and other terror organizations, they hold both ideological, cosmic, eschatological meaning end time ideologies that simultaneously parallel their political objectives. Those two things operate and happen one and the same. So for the IRGC to bend the knee politically would be to forsake their eschatological mission, which, if they're fundamentalist, if it's a death cult, as the IRGC is and other Islamic fundamentalist terror organizations are, death is the answer, not diplomacy and Western engagement and just talking about how, actually, it does benefit us to engage with you diplomatically, because if not, that means death. If a terror organization welcomes death as glorious and heroic and honorable, the entire calculus of diplomacy and war negotiations completely changes. So if someone having a nuclear bomb is the threat, then why don't we attack North Korea? Well, one, I'm not even sure how good their nuclear weapons actually work. But second, Kim Jong-un is fundamentally deterred by his own mortality, because in North Korea, even though there's this the state level edification and deifying of Kim Jong-un and his family, it's not fundamentally a religious theocracy. It's a communist totalitarian dictatorship. And Kim Jong-un knows, remember when President Trump said, well, I have a bigger button and mine works, he was essentially saying, you act aggressive towards us and I will wipe you off the face of the map. And that deterrence works for a regime that doesn't define its success eschatologically or in the afterlife. So the reason I go on that long prefacing ramble is because everything I discuss with Glenn is path dependent on a historic context and challenging him to define his terms.
He announced them. He announced them as with the United States in 2024.
All right, pause.
Good talk to you. Hello, how are you? Good to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you too. Okay, so I want to get back to the prompt about peace versus war. So the way I look at it is the first Trump administration was a peaceful administration. There was no new wars that were started, right? We had the Abraham Accords, which Trump should have won a Nobel Peace Prize for because it was historic. And then we had something that was ahistoric, right? So the Biden administration came in between and kind of disrupted Trump's foreign policy. And under the Biden administration, we saw the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was really a green light to our anti-Western adversaries that we didn't really have a strong will to defend U.S. hegemony abroad. Following that, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And then we saw Biden trying to re-engage in JCPOA negotiations as a legacy of the Obama administration. And he unfroze $16 billion in assets to the regime and then also waived sanctions that could sell over $100 billion. They're there. They're frozen.
Iran's assets.
Correct. But that's going against the maximum pressure campaign. So if you don't want war, how do you then deter a belligerent actor if it's not maximum sanctions? What would your solution be then?
Well, in general, in every other country on the planet except the United States and Israel, war is talked about as a last resort, something that you engage in only if there's a country that's attacking you, or attacking your homeland, or attacking, what's that?
So the sanctions are a legacy of the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. So which war? We're talking about the current operation, which is not a war.
I'm talking about why we should be at war with Iran at all.
Right, the second.
And you're saying, what is it that we should be doing to
Well,
Iran?
I'm saying my point with talking about the Biden the Biden administration was that they empowered, we could maybe use regime. They empowered the Iranian regime diplomatically, financially, which then positioned them for October 7th. And also the Houthis. It is true, the Houthis blocked off the Suez Canal for 4 to 5 months. We also had British military naval ships in the region, U.S. military ships. So they weren't just attacking Israel, although yes, that was a part of it. So we saw a destabilized Middle East because of the direct
Okay, so
empowerment
let me just, it's interesting because I think there's a very American perspective because we are a country that is constantly at war, unlike everybody else on the planet. The last time China fought a war was 1979, and one of the
in this part of the debate, what I was attempting to do was define the terms of what makes peace and what necessitates war. So, as I pointed out, the Biden administration essentially ruined U.S. deterrence abroad. He withdrew from Afghanistan, as I said. Then after that, it was a green light. We saw Russia invade Ukraine. There had been a status quo there for many decades that Russia would not invade Ukraine because it would then undermine Western interest. And then we saw October 7th happen. Now, the Biden administration unfroze $10 billion in sanctions from Iraq back to Iran, and then another $6 million in a hostage exchange deal. They also waived sanctions and allowed Iran to sell their oil to the numbers of hundreds of billions of dollars to China, for example. So we financially empowered the regime because it had been economically constrained. The regime could have the objective politically to export the revolution across the Middle East. However, if they didn't have the economic means to do so, they're still constrained. And then by definition, Iran is a manageable threat. So what Glenn is objecting to is that the United States even freeze their assets, which to me strategically makes zero sense. So I ask him, if you don't want war and you object to sanctions, then what is the solution?
They're displacing the United States and every region in the globe, including Latin America and Africa, is because they spend their resources building up their country while we have our country deteriorating because we spend so much time and money and effort and resources on foreign wars.
Is that they don't have the conventional capabilities to enact
they have a massive, gigantic military. They just don't. They just know that, which is what, by the way, which was what President Trump's primary political appeal was that we're constantly fighting these foreign wars. We have to stop fighting foreign wars. The guy who raised the flag on me,
he's like a groiper, which I think is so funny. I was like, why are groipers debating this at all?
Back in another one. But I think the point about Iran is that the idea that we can just go and steal countries' money, as you said, it's Iran's assets. They have oil in their country. Let me just finish. They sell their oil to other countries. They receive money for it. We take that money using our dollar as the reserve currency. We steal it and freeze it, and then somehow I should also say that President Trump just lifted sanctions on Iranian oil at sea, enabling them to get huge amounts of money.
It was a good faith.
No, so what he talked about with some other individuals before I debated him was the Strait of Hormuz is closed, it's going to cripple the whole world, the blah, 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 the fear-mongering that everyone has talked about, although we're a month and a half in and somehow the global economy is still afloat. You can still buy groceries. Is the price at the gas pump uncomfortable? Yes, but it's still nowhere near the $5+ a gallon that it was in 2020 under the Biden administration. He also, in another part of the debate, basically says, well, the Houthis were just attacking Israel. And I also corrected him and said, no, they actually closed the Suez Canal for like 5 months, and that hindered global cargo trade. And so what he's saying is it's wrong for the United States to freeze the assets of another country. Again, fundamentally, Glenn, then what is the solution to deterring Iran from them acting aggressively against not just Israel? Because he frames this entire debate between the United States and Israel versus Iran. Saudi Arabia, I think today or over the weekend, said that they would recognize Israel if that was going to yield some sort of outcome with Iran. The entire architecture of the Abraham Accords under President Trump's first administration hinged on the threat of Iran. What do I mean by that? The status quo for Arab nation states has always been to ignore the sovereignty of Israel. Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, Sudan, they recognized, all Muslim countries, they recognized Israel and then increased their diplomacy and their economic interconnectedness. What is economic interconnectedness? It is when you increase trade between countries to intrinsically align their interests. That's why the UAE, during the Iranian strikes against Israel in May of 2024, helped shoot down missiles, because if their interests economically are tied to the state of Israel, then they're encouraged to respond when Israel is aggressed upon, because now their interests are tied to Israel. So what Glenn does this entire debate is he tries to frame the war in Iran as the war against the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. controlled by Israel's interest, and meaning the only reason we were going to war was for Israel. But it completely ignores our Gulf Arab allies, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who view Iran as a security threat in a very similar way that Israel does.
The oil, because gas prices are so high.
It's still lower than it was under the Biden administration.
No, I'm saying because of this war, President Trump lifted sanctions on Iranian oil.
Yes,
they are now charging money. They are now charging money for the Strait of Hormuz, and
yes,
the and there's no way there will be.
Yes, the Biden administration lifted sanctions on Iranian oil in the summer of 2023 during a time of cold peace. So the regime became economically empowered, and then we saw October 7th happen, and they were able to fund the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea. They were able to fund Hezbollah, and they were able to fund Hamas. President Trump is strategically alleviating sanctions as an act of goodwill to China, and also as a bargaining chip in the negotiations with the IRGC. So in the case of President Biden, it was a stupid policy that emboldened the regime during a time of cold peace in which we didn't need to alleviate sanctions for Iran. And President Trump's act of alleviating sanctions is a negotiation chip and also a way to lower the temperature of then maybe China getting involved and escalating this into a larger conflict. So Biden, stupid, Trump, strategic. And Glenn knows that.
Completely wipe out the need. Let me just get back to what I was saying about the Biden administration, because it's important. So we look at how diplomacy has never worked. The JCPOA completely empowered the regime. Same thing with Biden again. So Trump came into a region that was completely changed. Also just globally, right? I believe the Iranian regime bought 2.5 million acres in Venezuela, which is in our Western Hemisphere. So he came into a world where our anti-Western adversaries had gained strategic holdings that hinder U.S. hegemony abroad. So he went into the region and he said, okay, I'm going to negotiate with the Iranian regime. They didn't come as good faith actors to the negotiation table. Operation Midnight Hammer was a preemptive strike. They still continue
Was
to come
Biden
to
at war
the
with
table.
Iran?
I would say, yeah, it's hard to be at war with a regime that you're funding.
So Biden was not at war with Iran?
Well, we were at war with Iran via Israel, if you want to look at it as a proxy situation.
So Biden was fighting a war against
and also
Iran?
Another thing, you keep saying that Trump started wars in Yemen,
I'm trying to
in
figure out
Lebanon. Again, but those are proxy wars funded by Iran.
Was the United States at war with,
way before
was
President Trump
Biden waging a war against Iran?
He was funding the regime and empowering them.
Okay,
so the answer is no. It's really hard to wage war against a regime that
exactly. So the war in Iran was started by President Trump in the second term.
The war
correct?
in Iran is first off, it's not a war. It's an operation. We have highly discriminately taken out
what would
as
be
the
a war
IRGC.
Be? How is it not a war?
Well, it's not a war because the Iranian regime can't respond in a way that necessitates
We're blowing up the bridges.
Yes, it's an operation. And they've been blowing up the Middle East.
No, I'm just trying to, again, the proposition we're supposed to be discussing.
Right,
and I realize why you don't want to and others don't want to.
No, I am. I'm demonstrating how the regime was empowered when Trump came to office, so it necessitated a response that was different than his first administration when there was peace restraints.
You have to let me finish. What the question we're supposed to be debating is that President Trump is more of a war-making president than a peacemaking president.
He came into a situation in the Middle East that was vastly different than the one that he left.
I understand. I'm trying to ask about war, which is
what is the response? So if it's not high pressure,
was President Biden?
So he hyperfixates on the term war. Earlier on in this part of the debate, when he was debating someone else, he claimed that in President Trump's first term, he waged war against the Houthis in Yemen. And then when he was discussing Biden, he was saying, well, those weren't wars. So he's wanting to shapeshift between what were proxy conflicts and what is war. Because again, the premise of his claim is that Trump is a war-making president. So I would say if you define the proxy war between Hamas and Israel, then the United States was at war with Iran. We directly militarily targeted the Houthis, which are just essentially another arm of the IRGC under the Biden administration. And I should have asked, and this is something I should have asked, I should have said, well, so then we were at war with Libya under the Obama administration? Were we, Glenn? Because both U.S. and NATO intervention in Libya under the Obama administration lasted 7.5, almost 8 months. And technically, if we look at the definition of war and what the president's powers are to enact military action without congressional approval, we're still within that 90-day window, which then wouldn't define this as a war or a declared war. Beyond that, the United States actually hasn't been in a declaration of war since the Second World War. So I'm not entirely sure why he was so hyper fixated on the definition of war, other than the entire claim hinged on the word war. But he's not interacting with the mechanisms of war. Because then at that point, we can call it a war, we can call it an operation. But if you don't engage with the consequences of it, the necessity of it, then you're really just playing word games. You're not engaging in the consequential externalities of engagement with Iran.
Answer that? Why can't you answer?
If Iran is considered the Houthis, the Hezbollah, Hamas, then yes, we
President
were waging
Biden
a war.
was waging a war on
yes,
Iran.
via our proxies.
I thought you said he was so favorable to Iran, that he was treating Iran so well.
Yeah, both sides of the conflict, but he empowered the regime.
Were we at war not with Iran's proxies, but with Iran itself under Joe Biden?
Iran actually broke the status quo of not engaging with Israel, our greatest ally.
Did Joe Biden wage a war on Iran?
It's not. First off, again,
why can't you just answer? Why can't you just answer?
I just said yes. If you're going to consider via proxies, which
no, I don't mean via proxy. I mean directly with Iran.
Okay, but you're contradicting yourself, because you said Trump started wars.
I'm only asking a question. I'm only asking a question.
You can't define war one way for Trump.
I'm only asking a question.
We got to pause there. We're out of time.
That's the end of the first debate. He was shape-shifting and evading his terms again, just to craft the really shallow argument that he put forth. This was the second part of the debate I did, and I'm responding to bombing Iran is not in the American people's interest.
Okay, so I would like to clarify. When you say that we are bombing Iran, I would like to say we are bombing the IRGC. This has been some of the most highly discriminated.
I got fact-checked at this part of the debate, and I really appreciate that Jubilee does the fact-checking, because I think it keeps it honest on both sides. When I came to debate him for this topic, I really wanted to be clear that we're not bombing the Iranian people. Very little to almost no civilian infrastructure has been hit. Civilian infrastructure is defined as like roads, bridges, electricity grids that are for civilian consumption. Now, military infrastructure and nuclear infrastructure have been hit. So there's distinctions. Now, this has been highly discriminate warfare. What does that mean? It means the United States and Israel has targeted heads of the IRGC and taken them out while largely protecting the civilian population. There was one bridge that was hit, which Glenn's about to make a huge deal about this one bridge. You know, forget the fact that the IRGC killed 30,000 plus of their own people and their currency is worth less than the paper it's printed on. Forget the hopelessness of the Iranian people. That one bridge is the most horrific thing that the Trump administration could have ever done. It's ridiculous. And then he's also going to reference the school, the all-girls school that was hit, and I believe 160 to 170 young schoolgirls were tragically killed. I make the claim in this video that it was actually an Iranian misfired missile. And still the reporting on this is not concrete. In the Hamas-Israel war, the Al-Shifa hospital bombing was a missile from Hamas that hit the Al-Shifa hospital. And they claim that like 500 innocent hospital patients were killed by an Israeli missile. That was a complete lie. The BBC even reported on this, knowing that that was misinformation. And I believe the missile largely hit like the parking lot of the hospital as well. It didn't even really hit the patient wings. So they inflated the death toll. Because remember, terror organizations typically inflate death tolls because in a grievance-based struggle, where a terror organization is fighting an asymmetric war, they benefit from casualty numbers that are inflated or falsified, versus a democracy at war is incentivized to report accurate death toll numbers and to engage in highly discriminate warfare, because if not, it greatly hurts the administration or the government's audience cost, popularity, or support with their own people, which is why we've seen constraint on the American side. So the fact check says, some, including Trump, have suggested the bombing of the girls' school in Manab, Iran, could have been a misfired Iranian missile or a ploy to slow Israel-U.S. aggression, essentially a lie, saying, look, the United States is killing young, innocent schoolgirls. And also the fact that it is schoolgirls is really interesting to me because I wouldn't necessarily classify the Iranian regime as being protective of their women. In fact, I now believe that that school was placed there on purpose, and they put those girls' lives at risk, knowing that there were military operations targeting military sites because, as this fact check points out, various sources, including some of the Pentagon, concluded it was most likely a U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile that struck the building, which was formerly part of a nearby military installation. So they put this all-girls school in an official military site. This is exactly how Hamas operates, right? They hide behind a hospital, they hide behind a church, they hide behind a school, a playground, and they embed their military infrastructure behind civilian infrastructure. So this is just part of their playbook that we've seen them use in their proxy wars as well.
Talking about, there's some credible intel that it was a misfiring from the IRGC, just like with Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza.
Nobody thinks that anymore, but go ahead.
Okay, so even if...
But what about that bridge? What about so the bridge is used by, it was a bridge built to be used by civilians,
I'm not going to get hung up on one bridge, okay? For the dismantling the IRGC.
But we're trying to blow up all their power plants now, too.
Okay, we are trying to get the Iranian regime, which is belligerent, to the table. So this is what I view as in America's interest. Having an aggressive power in the region, which seeks to export the revolution. Someone else already mentioned, they are fighting a cosmic war. It's really hard to negotiate with terrorists whose own mortality is a welcome martyrdom. So the cost-benefit analysis and the negotiation table with Shia extremists is going to look a lot different than any other nation around the world. So I view taking them out not only in America's interest, but in the interest of our NATO allies in Europe.
Getting rid of the government?
No, taking out the heads of the IRGC. I'm not talking about regime change, and Trump actually has never stated that as the official objective of this war.
But he did tell the Washington Post that freeing the Iranian people was the main,
it will be
most
yours
important goal.
It will be yours to take. He said that is a positive externality. That is not the war aim. There's a difference between a positive externality and a war aim, and that is what President Trump stated.
Do you know the Washington Post interview I'm talking about? Are you denying that something you hadn't read?
Glenn,
I know. I want to encourage people to go and read.
Don't insult my intelligence in the point I'm making by myopically focusing on one Washington Post article.
I take the president seriously when he says this is what my most important goal is.
He said it was to take out the IRGC's infrastructure. Again,
that's not what he said. But okay,
infrastructure. And again, he's never said regime change. He said it will be for
the IRGC still in power?
Well, then you're acknowledging the great success of this military campaign if you're saying that they're not in power.
No,
so
they
that's
are.
Why this is a great.
I asked several people now. The goal of this war, or the goals of.
So Glenn is really, again, hung up like he was on defining, what is war? Are we at war? Are we at war? He wants to myopically focus on regime change, regime change, regime change. Now, the reason he wants to focus on that is because for the new right, Iran has been characterized as an Iraq 2.0. That the United States is going to go in and we're going to enact regime change. Our sons are going to go die on foreign soil for another failed regime change to instate a democracy in the Middle East. This is going to be Bush administration policy 2.0. President Trump has never said that regime change is the United States' stated objective. It is a positive externality. He, in his original tweet, said the government will be for the Iranian people to take. It will be theirs for the taking to then change. So by eliminating the IRGC, he then creates a vacuum for the Iranian people to put in place a new leader, a new leadership, or an interim government. I do believe that the United States should actually play a larger role in helping to facilitate that transition, because in that power vacuum is where we would see extremism come in. The stated objective of this war, military operation, whatever you want to call it, one and the same, has been to eliminate the threat of the IRGC's capabilities, both their ballistic missiles and their nuclear weapons.
The IRGC's offensive military capabilities, which is not just a nuclear weapon. It can also be ballistic missiles, which can reach the interior of our NATO allies in Europe, which they didn't know before the start of this operation.
We're currently negotiating with the Iranians, right?
What are you waiting for? What's the alternative, Glenn? Do you want them to hit a NATO ally country and then we're in a larger scale war? Is that a positive alternative to you?
Israel has a huge amount of huge nuclear stockpile.
I'm not even talking about nuclear capabilities.
And there are tons of countries that have intercontinental.
They're not belligerent actors who are fighting a cosmic war and aren't deterred by their own mortality.
I think Israel is fighting a cosmic war.
They are not fighting a cosmic war. No, they're not. They're not fighting an eschatological war.
They're religious freaks. The people who run Israel are religious and political fanatics.
They can have a different religious prescription than you and not be fighting a cosmic war. If they were fighting a cosmic war, God wouldn't exist today.
Let me ask you a question. If the Iranians are these extremely irrational people who seek martyrdom and want to die, why are we now negotiating?
We haven't been able to diplomatically negotiate, Glenn, and now it's a month and a half later. So thank you for proving my point.
Iran deal
destroyed them.
before.
We eliminated
But
their
you're
air
saying they want to
capabilities.
die.
We
They want to
eliminated their
die.
naval
But they want to
so many
die.
of them have died.
But you're saying they want that. Why would there be Iranian officials currently negotiating into the war with the United
Because
States when
they're
you're
realizing that the
saying
end of the
these are
regime is
religious
near.
fanatics who want to die? Why
The
would
end
they
of
want the war to
regime-
end then?
Because the end of the
I find it so interesting that Glenn would say Israel is fighting a cosmic war when there's no united eschatological prescription of Israeli government. Judaism itself doesn't have the infrastructure of like a heaven and hell. There's also a huge missing piece in claiming that the Jewish people and the Israeli government are just these zealot religious fanatics who are belligerently killing people across the region. The Sunni extremists believe that their second coming of the Messiah will come when chaos is exported across the region. So they're incentivized to act belligerently. That doesn't exist in a Jewish context. Diplomacy with the IRGC has always gone back and forth because they're interested in the survival of the regime fundamentally. And so as long as they can stall and spoil a diplomatic agreement, and the longer they can draw this war out, that's a win for them.
America and Europe. They have ballistic missiles that can reach the interior of our NATO allies. The rest of the Middle East.
Nuclear armed NATO allies?
You're
They're
so
gonna do that?
myopically focused on Israel when it comes to
I didn't
Iran
mention
and the Middle
Israel.
East. I'm talking about this entire debate. You have the entire Gulf states. You have Saudi Arabia, you have Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE. All of these countries also benefit. So you're trying to myopically focus and propagate Israel as a motive for this war.
I thought we were
shouldn't be
America
there.
first. Why? So
We
now
are
we're
America
fighting a
first.
war for
What is
purging
your
both tyrannies?
What is your alternative? So
The
you don't agree with
alternative is
sanctions
to-
because it's their money. You don't agree with responding to provocation of the Iranian regime.
I think the Iran deal worked very well. I think the Iran deal worked very well. I think
and their
you
military
asked me
proxies.
my solution. I can only tell you if you stop talking for like 3 seconds. Just breathe a little
Sorry,
bit.
you-
My
you
solution
spew
is
so
that
much false
you're not. You
information,
can't
it
stop
stops you.
talking. My solution is the diplomatic solution that we had
Diplomacy has never
from
worked.
2015 until 2018 when the Iranians were allowing IAEA inspectors into
Yes, and
every
they
single nuclear
continually
facility,
reported that they were
and
not
the
complying with the
IAEA
JCPOA,
reported
which is why Trump
18
let the sunset
times
clause
from
go.
2015 to 2018 that the Iranians had not enriched beyond 3.67%. The prime minister of the country that you seem to really like, which is Israel, has said for 30 years is that the Iranians are seconds away, minutes away, weeks away from getting a nuclear weapon. For 30
Going
years,
from
the Israelis
60%
have
to
told
90% is
Americans
like 1%.
have told Americans this, and yet they never have.
Okay,
Tulsi
so you're a
Gabbard, who
propagandist
runs
for the regime. We've
Tulsi
established.
Gabbard, who's not an Iranian, but the American director of national intelligence,
so you're a
goes to.
propagandist
This
for
is what we all. I think you're probably too young to have lived through the Iraq War, but anyone who stood up and opposed the Iraq War, the worst disaster in American history of the last 100 years, was told, "You're a propagandist for Saddam Hussein. You're rooting for the terrorists in Iraq."
What
This
happened in
tactic
Iraq is
doesn't
completely
work. This is a
different than what's
bullshit
happening in
tactic.
Iran.
I'm an American citizen.
Saddam
I care
Hussein
about
let
American
UN
interests. I'm
weapons
not
monitors
a
in after
defender
UN
of
Resolution
Iran.
1441 to go and inspect their weapons capabilities. The Iranian regime has not done that. They kicked out the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Only once the deal was invalidated
Okay,
by
so if they're
President
such
Trump.
good faith actors, why wouldn't they just let them stay?
They comply with their treaty that Israel refuses to sign, which is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Every country in the world except 4, Israel, India, Pakistan, and South Sudan,
So
signed that deal.
I wanna
And
understand
under that
what your-
nuclear non-proliferation deal, the IAEA
I'm not
inspectors
just
are allowed
talking
to
about
go
their
in,
nuclear
and
weapons.
Iran
I'm talking about
allowed
other
far
offensive
more
capabilities.
invasive
Listen,
capability,
Glenn,
far more.
it's IA 101 that when your adversary races to arms and increases their offensive capabilities, it's going to create a security dilemma.
That's a madman
for the West.
mentality.
No,
Every
it's
country
not.
in the
That's
world
how
is
all
building
history has
arms. The
worked.
idea that we're supposed to go and bomb every country that we're in conflict with.
Okay, so there was a lot of yelling because I was trying to get really frustrated with Glenn. And I was trying to hold him to his definitions because, again, Glenn tends to shapeshift. So, number one, interests of the American people. We have to zoom out. Because on paper, is what happening in Iran a direct interest of the United States? No. But if you zoom out and you provide the historic context, the security context, and the larger scale alliances that we have in the region with NATO allies in Europe and our Gulf allies such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even on paper Qatar, although Qatar is a messy ally to have because they're in bed with the IRGC and Iran, and then also our alliance with Israel, Iran most definitely is at the center of that security apparatus and the threat that needs to be addressed in order to secure the security of all of our allies. Because how does an escalation to a regional war, like Tucker Carlson fearmongered that this would be World War III, how does that end up happening? Well, it happens if Iran targets their ballistic missiles, which now after the start of Operation Epic Fury, we now know could reach the interior of Europe and hit one of our NATO allies. Article 5 of the NATO Charter says if one NATO country is hit, all other NATO countries will come to the aid of that NATO country and fight back in retaliation, which would then guarantee a regional conflict and war, which fundamentally, from a strategic perspective, if Iran was trying to inflict as much chaos and destruction as it could, because remember that is its war aims and objective, is to breed chaos, then it is a huge security threat to our NATO allies. We saw the Iranian regime after the start of Operation Epic Fury raining missiles down on the UAE, on Qatar, on Saudi Arabia. Why? To breed chaos, to hope that then this would escalate into a regional conflict and war. Because again, if you are a nefarious, belligerent actor trying to sow chaos to usher in an S-time eschatology, that is your war aim. The IRGC has killed over 1,000 Americans in the last 40 years. So if you define America first as ensuring, as President Trump is doing globally right now, that there will not be a larger scale war now or down the road, then it is fundamentally in the interest of the United States. I asked Glenn, what is your solution? You just want to take a huge step back, alleviate sanctions, let them do whatever they want, and then when they hit a NATO ally, we just erupt in a global war? Is that what they're wanting? Iraq in 2003 was a huge mistake to go into. Saddam Hussein was cooperative with the UN and allowing monitors to come in and do an audit of their offensive capabilities in order to ensure the West that there were not weapons of mass destruction. A lot like Gaddafi in Libya, and then the Obama administration proceeded to carpet bomb and strike Libya after they had relinquished a lot of their military capabilities for literally no reason. Glenn didn't reference that at all. Interestingly, Saddam Hussein in Iraq was a manageable threat. And because Glenn loves to scapegoat Israel, it's important to also note that Israel warned to not invade Iraq. They said Iraq is a manageable threat, and it was. The fact that someone like Glenn can't say, okay, you know what, I don't necessarily agree with going in, but it is a huge military feat to discriminately take out 40 plus members of the IRGC, the head of the Iranian regime, to eliminate all of their air capabilities. So we have complete air superiority. We've eliminated most of their navy, and we've also eliminated their military infrastructure and their nuclear infrastructure. And while the enriched uranium is believed to be held in an underground mountain bunker somewhere, the infrastructure to enrich the uranium they have to a military-grade bomb has been destroyed. The Iranian regime has over probably $1 trillion, of which they don't have the money to rebuild in probably 5 to 10 years. And all of that was done with very minimal American military casualties, especially with Memorial Day just behind us. We remember and honor those who did lose their lives fighting for freedom. Thank you for sticking around. I know that I used a lot of very technical jargon, but I think it's important to engage in those concepts because these are really complex discussions. Like I said, that the woke right and the new right and the woke left and libertarians like Glenn Greenwald try and dumb down to the point that you're not actually interacting with these concepts from an intellectually honest standpoint. And that's absolutely critical and necessary when you want to get these issues right. Thanks for watching.